Greetings, everyone. Welcome to day 27. Wow, we really started at day one, and here we are, day 27. I guess that's how time works. It just keeps moving. And we're on day 27 and almost at the end of this 28-day journey of ancestral activation for Black liberation, where we're honoring and tapping into both our own personal ancestors, which is what we worked in the first week, and the remaining 3 weeks have been about community ancestors, where we can tap into the wisdom, the blueprints, the plans, the inspiration, the ideas that they left behind for us. Little did we know that we were going to need them right now here today. So if that's something that is your thing, you're interested in, whether it's Black liberation, supporting Black people, supporting Black women, connecting in with ancestors, learning about our history, the legacy that we stand on the shoulders of today, like, subscribe, ring the bell, do all the things so that you know when we go live. Again, we're towards the end of this 28-day ancestral activation. We have one more day tomorrow, but y'all know this journey ain't gonna end because it's gonna take a different form, which I'll talk more about tomorrow. But we have more to learn. We have more to tap into. We got more that's ahead of us, so we're gonna stay connected. We're gonna stay in it. So I am Barbara Ohuninifa. Thank you, Dr. Belazer, for joining again today. And I am an author, a coach, a speaker, and I work with Black women to recognize that we are beautiful, remember that we are powerful, and to be loved, and to really detoxify our minds, our spirits, and our bodies from the lies that we've been told over generations upon generations upon generations. We have much healing to do, but at the end of the day, we are who we are and we stand in that power, and it shows up every day as people come to us to help save them or to get love. And by I say people, I mean from as minute as the people in our families and communities to what we see happening on the world stage. They looking at Black women like, what are we gonna do? And so that's the work that I do. I work with Black women specifically because that's my lived experience, and that's what I'm here for. I'm very clear on my assignment in this lifetime. So again, if that's something that you want to connect about, there are links in my description, and I'm going to be talking more about that as we go forward too, because I really think we need it, whether it's the one-on-one coaching or some group programs that I'm going to put together. I really want to focus on one-on-one because of the needs of that, of us in that, and being able to get more personalized. But there's also medicine, there's also empowerment when we come together as a collective, even if it's small group, to work through these issues, because we begin to find that we're not alone and we can see each other reflected in each other. So there's lots more to come, because there's lots more to come, in the outside world, all the other things happening. So we need to be prepared and ready to stand in that power. And before we move forward, just thank you for your grace. I'm not on camera today. This is a strategic reason. I technically could be, but I want to preserve my energy so that I can be on camera tomorrow, because I've been trying to do every other day, but because tomorrow is the last day, and the basically power couple we're talking about tomorrow, I want to be fully present for that, and for the announcements and all the things we'll talk about tomorrow in our final day, day 28, and the celebration. We made it 28 days, y'all. I mean, we will have by tomorrow, but I know we're gonna make it. So the celebration is already coming in. So not on camera today. I will make it so you can see my little tiny little picture as it shows there. And so we'll be back here tomorrow with more things. I'm acting like we're ending it, but my point is I'll be on camera tomorrow. So let's get into it. Oh, and also we're not doing a meditation today, again, for sake of preserving my energy. And when we talk about decolonizing the mind, which is what we're talking about today as a part of our sacred restoration, our week of tapping into ancestors who did work to help us with healing, to help us with reclaiming the parts of us that we don't even know was missing, especially in this generation. Well, I guess it's multiple, in this time period where we have multiple generations. We don't even know those pieces of us are missing because they were stripped away and have been continuously stripped away for generations. Um, And one of those is decolonizing the minds. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And in lieu of doing a meditation around it to connect into that, what I'll do later is I'm going to post a link to a resource. It's a Google Doc that was shared publicly. You know, it wasn't secret. I think it was shared on Facebook from Dr. Aleye Kumari, who is a PhD. I do not recall what her PhD is in, but you know, she a PhD from Clark Atlanta University. Shout out to the alma mater. And she's also a chief and a Ianifa and an author and just all the things in African spirituality. I've actually taken some of her classes and they have been incredible. You know, and the classes, you don't even need to practice African spirituality. The class in particular that I'm talking about, set of classes were the feminine or female mysteries in Africa, and she broke it into East Africa and West Africa, and it was so deep. It provided so much context and understanding and pride for what this connection of being a Black woman. So anyway, she posted this resource that is a list of therapists, licensed therapists and counselors, mental health professionals who are African spiritual tradition friendly. They are either practitioners themselves or at least are open to the concept of it. So I want to share that because as we think about working with mental health professionals, therapists, which we advocate for, let go of that stigma, let go of that shit. We've been through too much to act like we don't need therapy. And that's part of decolonizing the mind, which again, we'll talk about today. These therapists, this list, even if you don't practice African spirit traditions, one thing you can know for sure is this list of people are going to have a cultural awareness that others may not. They're going to understand your your African centered thought in a way that other differently trained or differently or therapists with a different perspective may not. So at a bare minimum, this is a list where you can feel safe as a person of color, as a Black person, as a descendant of enslaved Africans, that these are people that you can go to work through your own personal process of decolonizing your mind. And trust me, we all need to. I see it all the time, the little things that we do. And again, we'll talk about it. So let's get into it. But again, I'm going to post that after because you know I can only do so many things at once. I'll post it so it won't be in the live chat. It'll be in the chat for the video itself once it processes. So like, subscribe, follow, do all the things so that you know when I post that. And so let's get into it, y'all. Talking about Dr. Kobi Kambon and Dr. Amos Wilson, ancestors that we give thanks for their contribution to freeing our minds. So Dr. Kobi Kambon. Let's start with him. Ooh, let me open my notes. I was just rolling and don't even have my notes open. Okay, there we go. So he was born Joseph A. Baldwin. So over period of time and through claiming his and reclaiming his own African identity, he changed his name to Kobi Kambon. And so um, again, born Joseph A. Baldwin, because as I look and honor ancestors, I like to understand and say their names that they mama gave them and say their names that they chose for themselves if they've changed it. Both are sacred, both are honorable, and we uplift them in both ways. I always go back to what your mama called you, what your mama named you. But anyway, okay, so Joseph Baldwin, he was born 1943 in Jasper, Alabama. Y'all remember the brawl in Alabama? Was that last year? Or the year before? These years are blending. Anyway, I just thought, anytime I see Alabama, all I can see is Aquaman swimming across the water. I'm just saying. And he was the ninth, Dr. Kambon was the ninth of 10 children. And obviously, the time period that he was born in, and in Alabama, I mean, apparently it doesn't even have to be 1943, it could be 1920 or 2024, but it was deeply entrenched in these segregation laws and systemic racism. I mean, again, not unlike now, but just much more open and blatant than what we have been experienced, but then we're seeing it come back even more so. I don't even know if it's that different than what we have now. There aspects of it are, but so his family, his mother was a teacher, Mama Mabel. We give thanks to her who gave birth to him. She was a school teacher and a community leader. So again, as the mother is so educated, so are the children. So she was a teacher and a leader, and she instilled academic excellence and cultural pride. And his father was a coal miner, but then he transitioned to being a Baptist minister. So he has this combination of education, spiritual resilience, and community leadership that he grew up in. And again, being the ninth of 10 children, so that means he had a whole lot of older brothers and sisters that was also helping to guide him. But to be clear, he was in that Jim Crow South. So he experienced all of the oppression and the struggles with liberation and the struggles with systemic racism and violence. So that was a part of what the foundation for this approach to liberation that he eventually developed. And of course, his mom was a school teacher, so he was going to excel academically. So he completed his bachelor's in psychology at DePaul University. And then he went on to get his master's in personality abnormal psychology from Roosevelt University. And then he went on to earn his PhD in personality and social psychology from the University of Colorado at Boulder. And that's where he began to critique this Eurocentric psychological model that was ignoring or misrepresenting African American experiences. You know how they do. And it really motivated him to shift his focus to developing African centered psychological frameworks. And we'll talk more about what those actually were. But understand his academic foundation was solid. 19, not okay, 2023. I knew it felt like it wasn't last year, but it feels recent. I'm telling you, these years just blur. So the month, the brawl was August 5th. You know what? Cinco de Negro. Oh my, can I write this down right quick? Where's my pen? Because we're gonna talk about this in August. We celebrating that date. Cinco de Negro. Did you make that up? Because I haven't seen that. That's hilarious. Okay, let me keep going. And so his academic foundation to do what he has done was solid, to really be able to understand and deconstruct it in a way where he's using psychological principles in that foundation, but dismissing the overarching Western thought process that dismisses us and creating something that is for us. Incredible. And so then one of the, which we give so much thanks for him, he went on to lead Florida A&M University, another HBCU. He went on to lead their psychology department. And that department became a hub for African-centered psychology. He was the chair of the psychology department for over 10 years. And he developed a curricula that really prioritized African worldviews. So all of the students coming through FAMU, Florida A&M, were trained in this African-centered psychology, this curriculum. And FAMU became a national leader in that. And we give thanks to him because he brought that and developed it along with these frameworks and tools that we'll talk about as we go forward today. And and speaking of those frameworks, I'll just tell you the names of them, and we'll break them down a little bit more as we go forward. So, African self-consciousness (ASC) was the framework that advocated and looked at the psychological and how we could psychologically protect ourselves against racial oppression. And then he created a cultural misorientation or CM theory or framework that explained and detailed how Black folks have internalized non-African values and how that disrupts our Black identity. I don't know about y'all, but I see it every day. Simple things, small things, which again, we'll talk about it, but one that comes into mind is how we can have this obsession with all things European, like somehow they're better, or an English accent, like somehow that denotes some kind of intelligence, or with things Asian, as if that's the only ancient culture on the planet. So it must be amazing. Now that's moving away from the Eurocentric, but it's still dismissing what is African as examples. But he developed these frameworks and tools, which again, we'll go forward and talk about them a little bit later, but these are all incredible things. And you can see that trajectory from his own lived experience, his education, and using the combination of those to do some things that were impactful and important for us as a people. on the path to decolonizing our minds and liberating ourselves. Because the idea is that liberation is going to start in your mind. Nelson Mandela taught us that you can be imprisoned, but if your mind is free, are you fully imprisoned? Do you still able to have hope? Which is part of what we talked about at the end of our session yesterday, is maintaining that hope. That's a mental, emotional, and spiritual process. Okay, let's keep going. So Dr. Amos Wilson, he was born in February 1941, but he was in Mississippi, Hattiesburg, Mississippi. I've been through Hattiesburg. I wonder what it looked like in 1941. Notice I said I've been through Hattiesburg. And it was during the height of Jim Crow segregation, much the same. I mean, they were like 2 years apart and a state away, Alabama, Mississippi right next. So they was having the same experiences, the institutional racism, the oppression, all of this contributed to him and his lifelong dedication to wanting to understand these systemic power dynamics, the concept of power and how it plays out. And he examined that. And all of these early experiences that he had helped him to go forward in that. Now, he achieved academic success where he focused on these Black realities. Now, he got his undergrad degree from Morehouse College, shout out AUC, Atlanta University Center. And of course, we know they cultivated and have always been known for cultivating intellectual leadership. He went on to get his master's at the New School for Social Research, where he specialized in social political psychology. Oof. And then he went on and got his PhD from Fordham University, where he explored how oppressive environments impact Black consciousness. This was deep. I mean, to look at the combination of power, politics, and psychology, he went in. Again, from his own lived experiences, made him question things. And his intellectual and educational pursuits gave him the tools to truly question it. Now, as an intellectual, he wasn't just an intellectual. He worked as a psychologist, he worked as a probation officer, and he was a training administrator in New York City's Department of Juvenile Justice. Now, you could imagine in that environment, he saw structural racism. He saw how Black youth were disproportionately targeted by the criminal justice system. And all of this gave him the insights on how to analyze the psychological impact of systemic oppression. I mean, he was literally working in the system of oppression and dealing with youth. And he talks more about that, or more in the work that was published actually after his death, and a Black Power worker, which again, Blueprint for Black Power, which we'll talk about in a bit. But he also published a document called Black on Black Violence, where he looked at the internalized oppression and the connection to broader racial power structures and how that manifests itself in internalized violence that we see, with each other. And in addition to doing all this work with the city of New York, he also taught at the City University of New York, and also at the College of New Rochelle, where he integrated the real world issues that he was seeing or had seen into his curricula. So if we were coming through his class, you were going to not just get theory, and you damn sure wasn't going to get theory based on Eurocentric views. You were going to understand what was happening to our people real time. And we give thanks to him for that, for the people who sat in his classrooms, who learned from him and were able to go forward from that. Now, his that I mentioned a second ago, that was one of the works that he created, was the Blueprint for Black Power. And that provided a comprehensive strategic plan, which we'll touch on a bit. I think that could be another homework piece, because it's beyond the scope of what I want to dig into, because we would definitely be here for a few hours digging into that. And just like a lot of the ancestors, the works that he left behind gave us all the answers. We just got to read them and break it down and apply it to now, and figure out some plans to actually execute. He also published, again, that Black on Black Violence, which talked about how systemic oppression creates internalized violence within our communities. He also published The Falsification of African Consciousness, And in that's where he critiqued the Eurocentric historical narratives and really outlined their role in cultural imperialism. So all of the lies that are told and published or whitewashed or sanitized, we have ancestors who wrote about the truth. These are the books that they want to ban. This is the information that they don't want us to have access to. This is actually an important aspect of maintaining our wisdom, our cultural wisdom, our ancestral wisdom. Dr. Belizaire, you had mentioned before I think it was an online bookstore, but a place where we can get used books. If you recall that, if you can put the name in the chat, that would be awesome. Because, as they're banning books, and you had a really good strategy as they continue to do that, and these used bookstores pick them up, tap into those and buy them up. Create our own libraries till we give thanks. Okay, let's keep it moving. Oh, one of your friends created that Cinco de Negro. Listen, they need to catch on. I'm about to be saying it. Okay, so let's talk about what they contributed. We're going to be here for a second, y'all, because they did some things. So I'm going to try to make it high level though. So Dr. Kobi Kambon, again, we give thanks. We give honor. We thank him for his life. We thank his Mama Mabel, for giving birth and for teaching her children, her 10 babies. And this one, and I'm sure they all did beautiful things, but this one has done some wonderful things for us. He was the pioneering architect of African-centered psychology, and he merged theory with action. He taught, he researched, he did community engagement. He did a lot for us, and we give thanks for having these strategies for mental liberation. So he, as I mentioned, he developed the African self-consciousness framework. And along with that, he developed a diagnostic tool to measure the African self-consciousness called the African self-consciousness scale. And so, and they both are not only diagnostic tools, but they're also a method for healing that'll help Black individuals know and recognize and resist mental colonization because it's so insidious. It just creeps right on in. So he defined it as an internal awareness of African identity, which can be a defense against psychological oppression. So this framework is a way of measuring your own and understanding what the scale is. The framework gives the outline of what it means, African-centered consciousness or self-consciousness. The scale enables a way to help measure how much of your own African identity you've internalized versus not internalized. If I were to make it a little lighter, I might say it's a way of actually defining kinfolk. You could be skinfolk, but how much of a kinfolk are you? And so, so there's a few principles of ASC. Well, let me go through all his accomplishments, and then I'm gonna come back to the framework and what the tool looks like. If I forget, somebody tell me, come back. No, not that direction, this direction. Okay, and then the other thing that he created was a cultural misorientation theory, or CM, and also a scale or a diagnostic tool to go along with that. So this is that he argued that a lot of Black folks suffer from cultural misorientation, where they adopt non-African values as their own and don't even know the difference. He says that cultural misorientation disconnects Black folks from their heritage, which leads to a psychological instability and self-destructive behaviors. We don't know who we are, y'all. And it's been intentional, but it's had a psychological effect on us. And by creating this framework and this scale, he gave us a way to, a language around it, a way to identify it, and a way to break it down, and a way to measure it, which in any approach, we need to know when we've actually made progress. So that's why you have to have something to measure. And the idea is that folks with cultural misorientation is an obstacle to liberation because people who suffer from it are mentally conditioned to uphold white supremacy, even if they don't know it. We see it playing out. How many Black folks had on the MAGA hats? And cultural misorientation, we have to identify it, confront it, and deprogram it for true mental decolonization to occur. That was his point, and that was his mission with creating that. He said, unless we address that, Black folks are going to remain psychologically enslaved. That's real. I'll come back and talk a little bit more about the principles of that as well, but I want to talk about the big overview of his accomplishments and his contributions and his gifts that he's left for us. The fact that he made African-centered psychology at Florida A&M as a part of their curriculum and led that transformation, because it wasn't like that before he got there. He transformed that department and created and made it into this hub. It centered African thought and rejected Western psychological models that pathologized our behavior, that made our behavior seem wrong, that made our behavior seem like something was off with us for wanting to be liberated, that didn't understand the things that happen in our communities were a result of oppression, were a result of the legacy or the continued impact of being an enslaved people. He rejected all of that and created the tenets in this department that trained others. So his brilliance, his work was able to get propagated into the future, into future generations, simply by his work there at FAMU, which we give thanks for. And then he used activism and public engagement. He spread the word. He beat the drum. He talked. He spoke at conferences and community events. He promoted mental decolonization as a revolutionary act. And he encouraged Black communities to come together and establish African-centered schools and media and cultural institutions, really reinforcing this idea of African self-consciousness, knowing that it couldn't be something we talked about, it somehow it needed to get integrated into how we rolled. So let me come back and talk about and I won't go too deep, I swear. I'm just going to talk about the core principles of the African-centered or African self-consciousness. The core principle one is that Black people possess a deep-rooted African consciousness, whether it's been fully realized or manifested or not. And the consciousness has been shaped by our African heritage, our communal values, our historical memory, our cellular memory. So again, part of that, one of the core principles is that we inherently have that. Doesn't mean it's been fully realized or has materialized in our lives, but it's there. The light is there. This little light is going to be there. We just got to feed it. The other thing is, another principle is that it functions as a protective mechanism against racial subjugation and internalized racism. The stronger you are aware and connected to your African core thought processes, and we can relate this back to Dr. Marimba Ani's work, which actually on the next slide, or in a couple of slides, I have a picture of the two of them together. So their work was connected as well, because this idea of how we think and how we see the world, we being people descended from Africans, how we see the world is fundamentally different. And that's part of the framework of African self-consciousness. And by having that strong within us, it enables us to more readily and easily reject Eurocentric values and resist mental colonization. An important part, which unfortunately, I would say probably from the 80s forward, was weakened. And they know exactly why, by shipping in so much drugs into our communities. That assisted the process, and I feel like we're seeing the long-term impacts of that now. But it's a light that cannot be distinguished. The core of who we are. And then commitment, another third component is the commitment to African liberation and empowerment. The stronger your African self-consciousness is, the more actively involved one is likely to be in uplifting the Black community, whether it's through cultural, social, or political efforts. Something within those who have a high ASC recognize that their psychological freedom is necessary for collective Black liberation. It's just something about it. And the fourth component is this idea that it's nurtured through education, spirituality, and cultural practices. So it's one thing to connect in with your Africanness, and I don't mean purely by how you dress or the music you listen to or the places you visit and things like that, although those are a part of it. And what he's saying is that these things help nurture it, but those are just really surface level. How deeply does it go? What are your circles do you move in? What are your beliefs? How do you practice your spirituality, whatever it is? How do you view education? What education, is important to you? Do you read and seek out scholars who are of African descent? Or do you prioritize and hold to a pedestal European thought? Because that's what we've been told is the benchmark. Or do you reject that? All of these things play a part into the model, and the tool itself, the scale itself, that can assess that. And it assesses things like racial pride and identity awareness. It measures psychological resistance to oppression. It measures commitment to Black community and liberation. It also measures how strongly you reject Black cultural norms. Trust and believe. I was like, is this available somewhere? You know how you can take every other kind of psychological test online? Of course, this one is not. It's used in research. Some therapists may use it as well. It's applied in educational and community settings, but the power of this cannot be denied, and because it uses a scientific method to evaluate mental decolonization. And in it, some guiding interventions to help restore our African-centered consciousness. This needs to be more broadly used. It needs to be more broadly talked about. It needs to be integrated in any and everything that has to do with Black folks. I would say with children, but nah, we need to work on the whole family. We need to decolonize the minds of a lot of grown people who have the ability to go to a poll and vote, including and especially the ones who just got that ability. Because I understand Gen Z, the Black Gen Z, showed their ass at the polls and not in a good way, because they don't even understand who they are whatsoever. That was a line from Erica Badu. She was preaching. Okay, so moving forward, and I'll just say a little bit about this because I've gone in so much about his first framework, but the cultural misorientation framework and theory, again, it talks about that Black folks suffer from this condition where they adopt everybody else's, and especially European, but at this point, we're talking about non-African values. So anything except African values. And the core principles there are psychological disconnection from African identity, internalizing these European worldviews. It's like that first model that he created, the African self-consciousness measures the strength of your consciousness in connection with your African root, your African culture, your African thought process and consciousness. This model, the cultural misorientation, measures the strength of your connection to the Eurocentric or non-African views. They work together, but kind of like two sides of the same coin. And okay, so moving on to the second principle of CM, cultural misorientation, is the role of systemic oppression. White supremacy and colonialism have deliberately imposed these Eurocentric values, and education, media, religion, political structures, all of it perpetuates it. How much of an impact have those things continued to have against us, and how much of us have unconsciously adopted those ideologies that work against our own interest? The third component is how it manifests. It manifests in people rejecting their own African heritage and glorifying European aesthetics, lifestyles, and in doing so exhibit these self-destructive behaviors. Again, we see it So much. People rejecting their own people. And unfortunately, quite often, these are people who are in positions of power, who look Black, who can give that aesthetic, meaning, if somebody wants to make a thing look like they're supporting Black people. But internally, they're so misidentified with their own culture, their own African heritage, and glorifying these European standards. They internally are unrecognizable. I think they might be unrecognizable to their ancestors as well, or at least very deeply saddened. And we can see that again in social, political, economic, and it shows up as colorism and anti-Blackness, as economic dependence, trusting that white-owned institutions are going to do better for us than those Black businesses. And again, the political misalignment. We already talked about that. People making moves in a way or making decisions in a way that harm themselves in the long run. And as we can see, it ain't even the long run, it's immediate. And again, this cultural misorientation is an obstacle to our liberation. So this is powerful work Dr. Kambon, sorry, that he did for us. And I mean, until I was digging into this, granted, I wasn't in the field of mental health or psychology, except for being a client of some therapists, I didn't know about this work. And again, we got to tap into the tools and resources that are here for us from our people, from our intellectuals, from our scholars that have lived the experiences and then got the education to then create something for us to work through those same experiences and to heal from those experiences. So moving on, and we give thanks, Dr. Kobi Kambon. Why do I keep trying to change your name? Dr. Kobi Kambon. We give thanks. So moving on to Dr. Amos Wilson. Now he understood power as the key to Black psychological liberation. And he didn't just critique it, he lived it. He actively engaged with Black communities to do the thing, to publish, to lecture. He put boots on the ground, and it wasn't just intellectual. So one of the things he did, again, he analyzed that relationship between psychology and power in the blueprint for Black Power. Now, that combines psychology, history, economics, and political science to argue that Black liberation requires strategic power building. We've been talking about that for about 4 weeks now. More so the last 3 weeks. The first week was really about grounding yourself in your own ancestors. But liberation is not just one thing, it's multiple things. And he lectured at Black nationalist events and community gatherings. He taught people how political and economic power directly impacts our mental freedom. He used case studies, empirical research. Again, this was an educated Black man who used his lived experience, both in his own early life and his education and his lived experience professionally working in the juvenile system, in the criminal justice system in New York. He used all of that to create pathways for us. And we give thanks for all of that. He defined power as the ability to control resources, institutions, and cultural narratives, and that our liberation depends on psychological empowerment. And, like some of the others that we've talked about, at least last week during Sacred Resistance, is that some of the integrationist movements, the civil rights movements that really almost look for approval. I mean, and that was how he looked at it, in that they didn't address the fundamental power imbalance that exists. To integrate into a system that is strategically designed to disempower a group and only empower one group, can you really even integrate into that? And how do you truly integrate into that? That was what he talked about in Blueprint for Black Power, and it is thorough. He goes through and talks about, I'm going to go ahead and do it now instead of coming back to it. He talks about defining power and its role in Black liberation, that we need to control our circumstances and be able to shape our reality and dictate our outcomes. And power is not just political, it's economic, it's military, it's knowledge, it's ability to shape culture. And then he talked about in it the role of psychology in maintaining white supremacy. Again, that was something that white supremacy is not just a political structure or a system of violence. It is psychological. Eurocentric psychology conditions Black people to accept inferiority. That was his argument. And that was what he resisted and pushed against. And in accepting that inferiority, it trains us to depend on white systems. So when people think about changing the world, changing the structure that we're in, it almost seems inconceivable. It almost seems like overwhelming. People will hyperventilate or say, oh, I just can't deal with it and just tap out. Because the idea of creating something where we are self-sufficient and not dependent on the structure, this capitalism, this thing that is crumbling seems inconceivable. And his point is, it's because we've been conditioned to do that. So first thing we got to do is take back our mind. The educational system, the media, religious institutions, all of it has been controlling the narrative and have impacted how we think about ourselves in the world. But we got to identify it first, and he called it out. He did. The other thing in Blueprint for Black Power is the need for economic empowerment and institution building. We got to create our own. We've been saying that damn near every day since we got into talking about community ancestors with the Sacred Shields Week. The wisdom from every ancestor just about was about creating our own economic systems. Black Wall Street, which we talked about in that first week, I think was the last day of the first of that week, Sacred Shields Week, talking about Black Wall Street, the dollar circulated 36 times in that community before it ever left. That is how you build wealth. That's how you make a strong community. So that means that they were completely self-sufficient within every Black-owned business in that 40-acre radius. Does that happen today? I still haven't gone and looked it up. I've been saying it since then. Been a little busy creating these, but the point is coming back to group economics and our own financial institutions and land ownership and buying Black, going out of your way to buy Black if you need to, and retraining your mind that somehow buying Black is inferior. That's also part of taking your mind back. But that was a key part of the blueprint for Black power. And then looking at political power as a tool for self-determination. We can't just have this symbolic Black political power. We need actual power. We got to organize independently. So his point was that we can't rely on political parties to represent our interests. We got to do it. Grassroots. Again, we've been hearing that for the last couple of weeks too. It is not some other structure that, again, these structures have not been created with us in mind. These structures have not been created for the benefit of humanity, really. It's really just been created for the benefit of a few. So if we want to invoke change, if we want to claim our self-determination, we have to organize at the grassroots. What does grassroots mean? Individual people, families, neighborhoods, communities, cities, like it rolls up from there, but it has to start with how are you treating the person that's in line next to you at the grocery store? How are you interacting with people? How do you go out of your way to interact with and connect with Black folks? And forming organizations that aren't just about capitalism. People good for coming together and being like, oh, we're going to do this. We're going to be a spiritual organization or even a church that's supposed to be a church, and really they checking your income taxes and making sure that you tithe the right amount. It's become a system of capitalism. Grassroots. Go back and look at yesterday's video when we talked about Dr. Kwame Nkrumah and the work that he implemented in what is now known as Ghana that actually resulted in them successfully gaining their independence from Britain. Grassroots was a key critical part of that. And Dr. Wilson brings it up here as a key critical part of claiming and using political power as a tool. It's grassroots. Ain't nobody coming to save us but us. And then the other part is that what everyone has been talking about, by everyone, I mean all the ancestors, Pan-Africanism. We ain't in this fight alone. This fight didn't start here in the United States. It didn't start in all of the other places where our ancestors were taken to work some kind of plantation or crop that contributed to European, and in the case of the US, United States, wealth. It started in Africa where they took us, where they took our ancestors, where they enslaved us. And it's still there because they colonized it. Ghana got their freedom, other countries have not yet. And our fight is not even only with the ginormous continent of Africa. And I have to say that because everything that we see makes Africa look like, oh, it ain't that big. It's a continent. So as we look to things that are happening, I guess with words I'm not supposed to say, I could say Gaza. Dude just dropped a AI created video talking about what he wants to do to Gaza and make it look like Vegas. All these things are related to our struggle as well. Now, how we go about looking at that Pan-Africanism, we need to get real strategic about, because what happened last in November was not the move. But it is true that our struggles are connected. And Dr. Wilson called for Black folks worldwide to create a transnational economic and trade network. Woo child. Listen, there's a lot of decolonizing of mind that would need to happen to see that. It's not impossible. But again, going back to Dr. Kambon's work, how many of the skin folks is kin folks? Can we apply this? Maybe we have the tools to come to assess folks to see what level of the liberation fight that they get to be a part of based on what kind of score they get on their cultural misorientation and on their African self-consciousness scale. I'm only partially joking, and the reason why I say I'm kind of joking is because we can't use tools to try to eliminate or to segregate people, because then we're doing just the same thing. But we do need to understand where people are coming from and who people are. So that might be one of the things that we can consider. So then moving forward, oh, was that it for him? Yeah, we're not going to go into his action steps because that's more around the wisdom that we're going to go into and summarize it. But I would agree to, we need to kind of look at that. We need to get access, get that book, take a look at it for yourself to see how you can apply it. And he criticized Western psychology for maintaining white supremacy through research, and he did his research in the public lectures. I mean, again, he wrote the books and he also talked the talk. He conducted workshops and community seminars. He got the word out and helped people to understand what was going on. He used scholarship and direct community education to break down the ways psychology was used to uphold racial hierarchies. He emphasized how education and mental liberation, how important it was. And he did that through grassroots initiatives, again, coming back to that, and African-centered scholarship. The fact that he worked as a professor at City University, trust and believe, yes, it was a career move, but that was a strategic move. Just like Dr. Kambon and his work at FAMU, he understood his role was to perpetuate the knowledge that he had gained, uh, the work that he had done to train others to take it further. So he stood in that gap and helping to educate and train students in African-centered psychology. And he traveled again to educational institutions, conferences. He hit the road. He did the thing. I'm gonna just start calling it when all of these people, well, we're towards the end now, but we have more to come. Towards the end of this journey, we'll have another journey that will start. I'll talk about that tomorrow. But the fact that he, all of them kind of went on the road and they would do, whether it was community workshop, lectures, I'm gonna just start calling it the Chitlin Circuit. And if you know what that means. He hit the Chitlin Circuit. And in doing so, he also advocated for independent Black economic institutions. And again, not only through his Chitlin circuit routes and circulations, he did this in his books. He did it in workshops where he talked about economic theory. So he went from like academic settings and intellectual settings, and he brought the information to the community so that everyone can understand it. So there's also tapping into that idea that we talked about yesterday with Dr. Nkrumah is inclusivity. Everyone, in order to get the groundswell, in order to get the grassroots momentum that we are going to need and that our ancestors' work has shown us is possible, we need everybody. Or the way I like to say it when I write, everybody. And that's part of what his work did by bringing entrepreneurs, activists, educators, community leaders, community people. He brought people together and gave the information with practical steps on how to do it. Definitely get his books, his work. Then he also did like radio interviews. He went on TV. Like Google the man. Google him on YouTube. Is that even a thing? It's crazy how Google is a verb now. But search him up on YouTube and see him speak. See Dr. Kambon speak. Listen to what they have to say directly. Educate yourself on what these practices and these gifts that they left behind for us truly are and how you can apply them as you work to decolonize your own mind. Because don't think that there's nothing left to do. There's still more that we can each individually and collectively do as we can see in the world. Even though you might be straight, there's still more that you can do to decolonize your own mind. And then if you're really, really, really good, create a group. Now I'm getting into recommendations, but y'all get my point. We got work to do, and these men, these ancestors left us behind intellectual thought that's centered on us, on how we can reclaim our minds and restore from this psychological oppression. So let's get into the wisdom that they left for us. I mean, if we didn't already kind of talk about that, but specifically, oh, and this is the picture. So this is Dr. Kambon with Dr. Ani that we talked about a couple of days ago. So, you know, of course they moved in the same circles and their work complemented each other and they worked together. That's why I'm like, man, there probably was a time where it was really a vibe in terms of these Black minds working together, connecting. Because as much as we understand the struggle and the fight, and Black folks get together, there's also a good party. That's what I'm seeing. They was doing the work, but then also having a party. So his whole thing was around this African-centered consciousness, if I got to boil it down to a thing. And this isn't a direct quote, but it's kind of a summary of different parts of his work, in that the wisdom would be the battle for the Black mind is the most critical battle of all. And let that sink in for a minute. Everything that we see on social media, on television, in all of the forms of media, especially mass media, but also social media, depending on what your feed look like and which platforms you're on, are all vying for our minds. As a former marketer, that's all it is. All the communication is trying to get a piece of your mind. And when we think about liberation, they being the powers that be, the people in control, the people who are desperately doing outrageous things to maintain that control, they are very aware that if your mind is inundated, if they can own your mind, then that gives them a free rein to do whatever they want. Mental liberation begins with an African-centered worldview. So I'm just summarizing some of the things underneath this wisdom that he's left for us, that Dr. Kobi Kambon has left for us. Psychological freedom requires that we reject Eurocentric frameworks. And the first step towards liberation is to reshape the way we see ourselves. through an African-centered lens, not a colonial one. That's very personal. I talked deeply about this in my first book, From Fat, Black, and Unlovable to Beautiful, Powerful Love, because that is how I saw myself, as fat, black, and unlovable. And it wasn't until going through a lot of internal work that I was able to uproot that and trust and believe, being constantly inundated with experiences, images, and mental pictures and um, words, all the things that try to reinforce the fat, black, and unlovable, meaning of not of value. If I just kind of summarize what that toxic thought means, it's an ongoing process of cleansing and renewing my mind to stand in the power and the truth of beautiful, powerful love. And I thank my ancestors for giving me that. But the point is, you got to reclaim your mind. And psychology has to be both political and cultural, and it has to serve the needs politically and culturally of Black people. So that's why I'm going to put that link in the chat after this live is done, after it processes, with a link to therapists that, and it's a link to a document. Again, if you weren't here at the beginning, it's a link to a document that was compiled by Dr. Aleye Kumari, and she shared it, may have been on Facebook. And it's a Google Doc where she's compiled a list of therapists and mental health professionals who are open, either practicing or at least open to African spiritual traditions, which to me is a huge signal that they are understanding and open to decolonizing our minds and understanding our African consciousness. So whether you are a practitioner in that spiritual system or not, this is a list of therapists that are going to be able to meet you where you are to help you on this journey. So I'll again post that later. And then the other component of this wisdom that Dr. Kobi Kambon has left for us, in that the battle for the Black mind is the most critical battle of all, is around the cultural misorientation, that we have to identify it and correct it. Most have unknowingly internalized some non-African values, and it's led to some identity confusion and dysfunction in our communities. And we don't even know it. We just think things are what they are without understanding that we have been conditioned over generations for things to be how they are. But the point from Dr. Kambon is that healing requires us to actively reject those identities that have been imposed upon us, and actively return to our authentic African consciousness. And I just want to state, because people will associate the idea of African consciousness with all things African right now here today. And I want to remind you that Africa and Africa's culture today has also been colonized. So you have to dig deeper, because oftentimes what we see presented to us as African culture is still a colonized version of African culture. So use your critical thinking, use your intuition, use your ability to read, ask question, have discourse, experience things, experience life to dig deeper. Yes, yes? Okay, keep it moving. And then Dr. Amos Wilson, power as the key. That was his foundation. And his quote, now this is an exact quote from Blueprint for Black Power. Power is the ability to define reality and have others accept that definition as if it were their own. Their own. Woo. We saw that play out. People, certain Cheeto colored people, certain inhuman looking people can just say things with no backing, no legitimacy, no facts, no proof, no anything, can just make up stuff and say it. But because they own the airwaves now, the airwaves, that's an old school term, but they own all of the media, AKA have power, own the resources, own the means, and therefore they have the ability to define reality. So we need to think about power, and we need to think about our place in that. And his lesson is that Black power is psychological, economic, and political. It's not just this symbol of raising up your fist and wearing cultural clothes. It goes deeper than that. Real liberation is rooted in controlling resources, institutions, and narratives. And also, again, going back to his criticism of white systems, that integrating into these white systems without power is just creating perpetual dependency. Again, having had my education at historically Black college, that's not a new concept for me, because our professors talked about desegregation wasn't necessarily all positive thing for us. It's part of what helped to dismantle our communities and dismantle our Black-owned businesses. Because now to look like you came up, you were going over to the white store that you weren't allowed to go to before. Because now you can. But we got to get back to buying Black. We got to get back to those things. He also talked about education as a tool for liberation or enslavement. Both. Western education can distort our history, our actual real history, both in this country and in the continent, and reinforce white supremacy and condition Black children to accept subjugation. Or independent African-centered education systems can teach Black youth who they actually are, who they actually come from. That's a whole different process. And then liberation requires strategic organization, not just emotional resistance. We can't just get mad. Dr. Wilson said we can't just be outraged. That ain't going to dismantle this oppression. We need structured, long-term institution building efforts. Now, if you combine that with the whole idea of grassroots, that means you can't look to these political parties to do that for us. They ain't done it yet. They ain't going to do it now. That does not mean completely divest from the entire political scene that's happening, but to understand it's going to take everybody stepping up. You cannot be complacent in this. And he laid out economic blueprints in Blueprint for Black Power as a roadmap for financial self-sufficiency and the different aspects and strategies that we need to take. Let our outrage fuel our action, just like love and courage fueled resistance and action when we talked about that during Sacred Resistance. But we got to have a roadmap. We got to be strategic and know this shit ain't going to happen overnight. We are simply the 2025 or the 2020 versions or the age of Aquarius leg of this multi-century fight for liberation. We got a job to do. Our ancestors did what they did. They passed the baton to us. Shit's hitting the fan. Now it's time for us to stand up. What are our ancestors or our descendants going to say about us as ancestors? Because we too will be ancestors. What are we doing? We got blueprints from our ancestors. We've been talking about them. We got plans. Something as simple as tapping into the love you have for yourself, tapping into your courage, educating yourself, knowing who you are, knowing what gifts and talents you inherited from your own ancestors. We talked about all of these things for the last few weeks so that you can ground yourself and you know why you chose to be here at this time during this particular part of the shit show. Because it really is not a shit show. It's beautiful. Life is beautiful. Being alive and being on this planet is beautiful. It's some power-hungry, damaged humans that make it seem like a shit show. But Mama Earth, she be out here flexing, showing us beautiful sunsets, warm breezes, but she will also show us some shit and set the West Coast on fire and freeze out the East Coast. But the point is, being alive is beautiful. What we gonna do? We got tools, we got resources, we got blueprints. So let's talk about how we can apply all of this wisdom, and we give thanks to Dr. Kobi Kambon, and we give thanks to Dr. Amos Wilson for the work that they've contributed to helping us as a Black people liberate our minds and giving us the tools on how to do that. that we only have to pick up and use. So mental decolonization is the key to restoring this Black consciousness and our power. But how do we do that? Summarizing everything from both of these ancestors. Part of it is African-centered psychology and education. They've created tools for us. Kambon with his ASC and CM frameworks and diagnostic tools. African-centered schools that have been developed, the National Black Independent School Movement, they applied his vision to decolonizing education. And we can create more community-centered, African-centered mental health initiatives that integrate those. I want to hear more about these tools that Kambon created that can help us to understand ourselves and each other better. So we can really get to the core of mentally what needs to heal within us. Because we can't always do what Dr. Franz Fanon talked about when we started this journey into sacred restoration. He talked about armed resistance. And as we learned from Dr. Nkrumah yesterday, armed resistance is not always the path to go because there can be a significant loss of life. So the route that he took in freeing Ghana was one of positive action and violent resistance. Differently than the civil rights nonviolence resistance here in the United States back in the 60s. Similar but different. Look into it, dive into it. But the point is African-centered psychology and education so that we even know these things that I just mentioned and know the impact on your mind that Dr. Kambon and Dr. Wilson created. The other thing that we can look at is economic empowerment. Again, this is not a new concept. We've been talking the last 3 weeks, but building cooperative economics and building institutions that are Black-led, Black-owned, Black benefiting, and these movements by Black, group economics, and the potential of Pan-African business networks, all rooted in Dr. Wilson's strategies. And we can see that by advocating for land ownership. We can expand our Black-owned financial networks and cooperatives, develop something new in terms of cooperative. So what comes to mind is Mr. Gurley, the man that bought the 40 acres in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and then because he had a vision, and then he subsequently sold pieces of it to other Black entrepreneurs who wanted to come and start a life and start a business. He owned a hotel, and I talked about this in depth in other parts of the Black Wall Street story in that video. But he owned a hotel, and that hotel was not only, was not only for people coming to stay overnight. He also preserved part of it or reserved part of it for micro businesses. And that was at a time where incubators, that's supposed to be this like new revolutionary or new thing in these last couple of decades here in terms of having spaces where people can rent or just kind of timeshare, for lack of a better phrase, spaces for their micro businesses without having to take out loans and get, and try to get actual real estate. He was doing that then. How can we take that idea further? How can we really start to work with each other instead of competing against each other? Everybody want to be the one in charge, but what if there was a way where there was decentralized leadership, which we talked about yesterday with Dr. Nkrumah, but what if there was decentralized leadership, but then everybody could eat? Cooperative business models, get creative, and don't just look to, or actually not even just, stop looking to capitalism and the way colonizers and imperialists think about and conduct business, and think about it in a different way so that we can truly be economically empowered. And then the other component is looking at how we build our communities and make connections. We're looking at and continuing to forge those transnational alliances. There's a huge movement amongst Black women to leave this country. We got Black women in all parts of the world that have sold their stuff, put their stuff in storage, done whatever, and left the United States, divested from this experience. And I'm like, hell yes. But that also means we got a network of Black women who understand this experience, who are somewhere else in the world and establishing a community there. That's a network. How do we tap into that, expand it? And again, not in a capitalist way, in a community centered way, and build and grow those connections. We can look at us worldwide and look at all of the frameworks we talked about here today and think about how do we strengthen that framework? How do we strengthen our connections? How do we look at economic sovereignty beyond the borders? We got digital tools now. It's completely feasible. Just got to think out the box and be willing to work together. But first, decolonizing your own mind so the idea of working with another Black person doesn't seem off to you. And let go of capitalist structures and ways of thinking. And it's all based on the concept of mind, economics, and power. Black liberation begins with African-centered consciousness, rejecting this way of looking at the world that Dr. Ani talked about in her work, and economic self-sufficiency, which many of the sacred shield ancestors spoke to. And Black Wall Street was one huge example, but there were lots of many Black Wall Streets that were destroyed. But that means we have the capability and we have blueprints on how we can do that and take it forward now that we're in the age of the Aquarius in this digital world. And we've always had the opportunity for global unity. And in that is where we have access to power. We have access to power right where we stand. But if we can actually look at other Black and brown people across the globe and understand that our fight is the same fight and actually have unity around that, that is a power that the beings on this planet that have colonized the planet can do nothing with because they actually are the minority. That's the other lie that's been told is Black folks walking around calling ourselves minorities. We are not a minority. I reject that word. So when we look at all of this, mental decolonization is a liberated mind, is liberating your mind, and that is the foundation for collective action. Without African-centered consciousness, Black people, we can't even effectively resist systemic oppression because you got some people just thinking they're resisting it, but really they upholding it. Or maybe they don't even think they're resisting it, but they are upholding it. How do we bring all that together to move forward? That's the question. That's the question you can sit with and breathe with. Dr. Kobi Kambon's emphasis was around African-centered consciousness, and he offered practical pathways to help us identify how we are not aligned with who we truly are, but also how we can heal mentally. That has to be a priority at the individual and the collective level. Dr. Amos Wilson's focus was on power dynamics and economic independence and this historical truth. And all of that combined to provide us with strategic blueprints on how we can strive for a sustainable liberation. Different approaches, different ways of looking at our minds, but also complementary. Their combined wisdom gives us some actionable strategies that we can use to reclaim our mental sovereignty. We need mental sovereignty, we need political sovereignty, we need economic sovereignty. And we have all of the wisdom with the ancestors to give us to understand how to do that. It's individual and collective. I keep saying that. We can come together and we do need to come together. You also got to do your work. You do your work, you come together with community, we can do the work together. We come together with other communities. And when I say community, I mean Black folk. the skin and kinfolk. And then we come together because it does have to be and need to be, in order for true liberation, it does need to be something that is, not only it's inclusive. Everyone needs to fight together and not, scapegoat one group while another one just kind of sits and does nothing or betrays what the overall group is talking about. I can say, and we got one more day of this journey. I give thanks for all the ancestors that have come before us and all the work that they have done. And I give thanks for this process because it's given me hope during this time when all of this is going on in the world. And, if you're watching this 10 years from now, if YouTube is still a thing 10 years from now, just, peep the history and see what was happening in the first part of 2025. Hopefully, it'll be a distant memory by then because we will have defeated imperialism and the world would be much different. I'm calling it. I'm calling it. So, with that, we're going to wrap up today by taking a couple of deep breaths because, as I said, we're not doing the meditation. You're going to go and find these speeches and talks from these two ancestors, and you're going to tap into what they had to say and hear it directly. And then later on, you'll come back to this video and click on the link that I'll share in the comments. They'll give you access to that list of therapists that will meet you where you are culturally and help you to decolonize your mind. Let's take a deep breath in through your nose, and then you'll hold and out through your mouth. Starting now. With that inhale, imagine you're inhaling in light and love and joy. Never let them take your joy. And when you exhale, you're going to exhale the fear. You're going to let your shoulders drop. You're going to let the tension go. It's going to release. So you're inhaling fresh, pure oxygen and exhaling everything else you don't want. And inhale through the nose. And one more time. Inhaling in all that love and joy and connection and solidarity. Seeing the light as you inhale move through your mind, cleansing all the connections and all of the lies that we've been told for generations. And as you exhale, let it go down like you're flushing it down the toilet. And you're going to inhale now. May you move forward in continuing the process of liberating your own mind. Because this entire journey, multi-century journey to liberation, starts in our own individual minds. And that you can do. Until next time, take good care of you.